Welcome to another exciting podcast of Royal Oak Victory Church. We're glad you've joined us. We are a community devoted to God, connected to others, and influencing our world.
I'm so honored to have the opportunity to speak this morning. It's always an honor when I have the opportunity. And one thing that you should know about me is that I'm very good at telling jokes. It's one of my top 5 gifts is joke telling. And so today you have the honor of listening to me tell you jokes. So good for you guys. So I have a couple jokes kind of as I start today. The first joke is sorry, I'm already laughing. What's the worst part about being a duck going through puberty? The voice quacks. What a joke. Beth told me that joke, and I thought it was so funny. And then this one is, who invented King Arthur's round table? Circumference. So those are my 2 jokes. Thank you for participating in that experience with me today. But my family and I, we used to go on really long road trips together. We'd leave in June when we finished school, and we'd drive, and then we'd come back sometime in August. We would just take the whole summer off, and we would drive to all parts of the world. We did amazing trips. We drove down to Texas and into Mexico. We drove through California. We went to British Columbia many times. We went on so many trips. It's so hard to remember them all. And you may ask, how did my parents keep us focused for hours and hours at a time? What we did is they actually bought us a state-of-the-art VHS player for our car. And so what this is you put the VHS in here. It was like a tape. And you'd put it in there, and then it would play a movie in the vehicle. And I remember when we got this thing, it looked nothing like this one. This is the fanciest thing I've ever seen. This is what we had, all dusty VHS. It was amazing. And that's how we kept focused. I think we watched like all the classic Disney movies. I think I watched Tarzan like 100 times. I could probably sing you the soundtrack today, but I don't know if you want to listen to that right now. But so that's kind of how they kept us being focused while we were driving. And one trip, we took a pit stop. We took a pit stop at a rest stop to use the washroom. And so we go out and we get back in our car and we start driving. And then about 15 minutes later, we decided, you know what, it's time for us to watch a movie. As kids, we're starting to get bored. And so I look, and of course, as younger siblings, we think, okay, let's let our older brother decide which movie we're going to watch. And so we say, hey, Scott, what movie do you want to watch? And then there's no response. And we're like, that's kind of weird. So we say it again, bro, like, what movie do you want to watch? No response. And so what we used to do when we go on road trips, we'd use duvets and pillows to keep comfortable. And so the duvet was covering the back seat of our car. And so we moved the duvet, and alas, my brother was not in the vehicle. Yeah, so what we had to do is, my parents, of course, they feel awful. They just abandoned their young son at a rest stop on the way to in Banff. And so we turn our van around. We're pulling a tent trailer, so it's not an easy process. We turn around. We arrive back at the rest stop, and there my brother is standing with the rest of the tourists, waiting upon our arrival. Just standing there waiting. He's like, I knew you'd come back. That was an interesting moment. He gets back in the car to apologies, and we get on our way, and we started watching probably Tarzan. But have you ever felt abandoned? Felt really abandoned. Like I know each one of us, we have moments of abandonment. We feel abandoned by our friends. We feel abandoned by our families. We feel abandoned by our coworkers or maybe our pastors. We feel abandoned sometimes. And I think we all have moments of abandonment in our life. And this morning, I want to share with you, in my opinion, what might be one of the most real moments of abandonment in history. One of the biggest moments of abandonment that we can see. And last week, as Pastor Dave shared, we started a brand new series called Instead of Me. And Pastor Dave started that series. And what we're doing is we're walking through the last days of Jesus' life together as a family. And we're going through the Easter story. And last week when we left Jesus, he had just had the last meal with his closest friends, and they had shared communion for the first time. And so we're going to pick that story back up. So if you have your Bibles with me, you can turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 26, which is the first book of what we call the New Testament. And you'll find it about 3/4 the way through your Bible. And if you need a Bible this morning, we have Bibles at the back, and we'd love for you to take one home with you. There's also an incredible app called the YouVersion Bible. You can download that app, and it's an easy way to stay focused on kind of the story that we're going through today. And if you don't have your Bible, we will have the scriptures coming up on the screen today. And so we will be in Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 36. So let's read this together. It says, "Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, 'My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me.' And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.' And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, 'So, could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak.' Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, 'My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done.' And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words again. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, 'Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.' While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people." You know, this morning, I just want to pray before we dive into this incredible story, that God will open up our hearts, open up our eyes to just receive something new from him today. So let's just open in prayer. God, I pray that you open up our hearts to receive something from you today. God, I pray that you will reveal yourself in a new way. And I thank you for what you did in that garden that day, God. We thank you for what you did. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, in this story, we see Jesus approaching death in a different way than I think we would expect. We see him approaching death in a different way. He's approaching it with fear rather than the boldness that we had seen him show throughout the entirety of his life. We see him almost approaching death with fear. He almost seems like he's weak in this moment. You know, why is he approaching this way? Because throughout Jesus' life, we see him approach situations with boldness and courage and not fear. You know, one time he's in a boat with his disciples, with his friends, and there's a storm raging around them, and Jesus is sleeping in the bottom of the boat. So the disciples that go down, they wake him up and say, "Get up, do you understand what's happening around us?" And Jesus gets out of the boat, looks at the storm and says, "Peace, be still," and the storm ceases. And then he looks at his disciples and he says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" You know, this is the same Jesus who just moments before the scriptures we read today, he's telling his disciples he wants to go to Jerusalem. And they say, "You can't go to Jerusalem. If you go there, they will kill you." Yet Jesus approaches that with boldness and defiance. "I'm going there." Yet here in the garden, we see him approaching death in a different way than we would expect. You know, we've seen so many movies, so many stories of people approaching their death with defiance, with boldness, with courage. You know, I think of Stephen, the first martyr, the first person who died for his faith, recorded after Jesus. When we read his story, he's approaching death with excitement and joy, saying, "I'm going to go see Jesus. You can stone me, but you can't take away my faith." He's approaching it. He's not afraid. There's no fear. He's approaching it with courage and boldness, no trembling. Yet Jesus here is approaching death so differently than I would expect him to approach it. He seems weak. He seems afraid. We can read it here in verse 39. It says, "And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will.'" We see Jesus here is so weak that he falls down on his face. He can barely stand up. He is so weak in this moment. So where is that bravery we have seen Jesus show before? Where is that boldness? Where is the courage? Why is Jesus approaching his imminent death this way? Now in verse 37, I think it kind of gives us a glimpse into what is happening. It says, "And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me. It says on his way to the garden, he says he began to be sorrowful and troubled. In this moment, he's seeing something he had never seen before. He says he began to be sorrowful and troubled. So something happened in that moment that started to make him feel that way. What was that? Something is revealed to him here in this moment that he had not seen before. What he saw here grieved him so much that it says he thought he would die from it. What he was experiencing, he thought he would die from it. This is before he went to the cross. He's in the garden, and he says he thinks he might die because of how he's feeling. What he's feeling on the inside, not the outward stuff, internally. And if we look at Luke's account of what happened here, it describes it this way. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, we know what this is called now. It's a medical phenomenon, and I'm not a scientist, so I can't pronounce it maybe properly, but it's hematidrosis. And it's a condition in which the capillary blood vessels that feed the sweat glands rupture, causing them to exude blood, occurring under conditions of extreme physical or emotional stress. Jesus here is in so much emotional stress that the blood vessels in his face burst. And he's bleeding out of his face. He's sweating blood, drops of blood out of his face. He's in so much stress here. That is what he's walking through. What did Jesus see in that moment? What is it that is revealed to him that he hadn't seen before? What is it? Why is Jesus under such emotional stress in this moment? And I think the better question to ask would be, what did he not see? Jesus had the closest relationship to the Father. He had the closest relationship to him, so much so that he would leave crowds of people to go be alone in the middle of nowhere with his Father. He would leave everything to go be with him. When Jesus got baptized, the clouds opened and his Father spoke to him and said, "This is my Son in which I am well pleased." He had closeness with the Father. But now in the garden, the Father is silent. For the first time in all of eternity, he sees silence. This is the first time we see the Father silent when Jesus is going to him for strength. The first time. The first time he hears no response. Silence. So what he does is he staggers back to his friends and he finds them sleeping. He sees them in his most honest time of fear, his most honest time of stress, sleeping. I think there's beauty in this moment. There's innocence in this moment, almost like that of a child who wakes up in the middle of the night with nightmares and approaches their parents and said, "Just stay up with me, I'm scared." This is honestly how Jesus is approaching this, is say, "Just stay up with me." Yet he goes to them and they're sleeping. It'd be like that of a friend who tells you that they have to go to the hospital to hear about a diagnosis for a disease they might have, and they just want you to go with them to be their support. But when Jesus goes back to his friends, they're sleeping. They're sleeping in a moment where one of the most influential, powerful moments in history is happening in front of them, and his best friends, the ones that he thought had his back, were sleeping. Being disloyal to the only one who has been loyal to them over the entirety of their journey together. So he says, "Stay awake with me," and then he goes back and prays in verse 42. It says, "Again, for the second time, he went away and prayed, 'My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done.'" What do we see here the second time? We see silence. He goes back to his Father and says, "I don't want to do this," and he receives silence. No response from the Father. What is happening in this moment to Jesus? What is happening? And a lot of scholars believe that this is the moment that the Father has started to turn his face away from his Son. It's the moment that the Father is starting to pour out judgment and his wrath on his Son. The only one undeserving. This is that moment that this is happening. Because Jesus, for the entirety of history, was living under approval of the Father. Everything he did with approval of the Father. Now he goes to the garden and silence. No approval, just silence. You know, New Testament scholar William Lane, he explains Jesus' feelings in this moment this way. So powerful. He says, this is the horror of the one who lived wholly for the Father, who came to be with his Father for a brief interlude before his death and found a hell rather than heaven open before him. What Jesus found in the garden was not strength. What he found in the garden was loneliness. He goes to get strength and he receives nothing. He feels alone, but he doesn't just feel alone. He feels rejected. He feels abandoned by his Father in that moment in the garden. Now, I don't know if there's any way that we can explain this amount of rejection, but I think of that maybe of a parent whose child comes to them in a place of being scared, coming to them in a place of need, and then the parent looks at them and says, "You are not my child," and then takes them and drops them off in a foreign place with no plan of returning. Utter rejection is what Jesus is experiencing in this moment. Utter rejection. Here what we can gather is that Jesus went to find strength and find his Father, but found hell in its place. Hell is the complete abandonment by God. Jesus here is experiencing hell on earth. He's experiencing hell in a real way. He's experiencing a complete abandonment by his Father. Yet he did nothing wrong. He lived a perfect life, never made mistakes, never sinned. Yet he goes for strength and experiences hell. I think a lot of us, me included, when I look at the death of Jesus, we think about the horrible ways he was humiliated, the ways he was beaten and murdered. We think about the worst part of Jesus' death was the crown of thorns, the way he hung on the cross naked, beaten to a point where you wouldn't even recognize him, humiliated, made fun of publicly. Some of me included, sometimes I thought that was the worst part of the cross, yet I don't think that is what made Jesus stagger in the garden. I don't think that is what made Jesus feel rejected in the garden. I don't think that is what made Jesus sweat blood in the garden. I think what made Jesus sweat blood in the garden was abandonment by his Father. For the first time in his whole life, he's not experiencing closeness. He's experiencing hell rather than strength. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is experiencing the cup of God's wrath for the first time. He prays 3 times. He says, "Please take this cup from me. If there's any other way, let it pass from me. I don't want to experience this cup." He's having an honest moment with his Father in their silence. He's being abandoned by his Father in the garden. This is one of the only times we see Jesus pray a prayer that is not answered. All he gets is silence. The only time he requests strength from the Father and gets silence. He's denied. The Old Testament in Isaiah, it describes God's wrath as a cup filled with poison. But as that cup is offered to us, Jesus steps in and he drinks it for us. I think about maybe a way to describe this is we hear the horrific stories of shootings happening all across the world. And then we hear of heroes who step in the way of bullets so that they can protect people. Jesus is doing that for us. He's drinking the cup for you. This is what Jesus faced in the garden. The opportunity to face the poison we deserve, to face the bullets we deserve. That is what he's faced with in the garden. That opportunity to take the cup that he doesn't deserve so that we could be saved. This is why I want to tell you that we don't just say that Jesus died for you. He died instead of you. Theologian Jonathan Edwards asked this question. It's a powerful question. Why would God open up the horrors of the cross like this here in Gethsemane? Why? Why not wait until he's on the cross to show it to him? Why give him the opportunity to decline to do it? Why do it now? To which his response just shows me the beauty of grace in powerful ways. That's what he says. It says, "It was so we could see Jesus could go to the cross voluntarily knowing full well what he was about to experience, so that his love for us would be put on display even more." Wow. That statement to me changes how I view what Jesus did for me. He knew full well what he was getting himself into. He knew what he was about to experience. He knew that the hell was in the place where he thought heaven was going to be. He knew that. Yet he looked right at hell and he went towards it for me instead of me. He chose to do it despite the pain, despite the fact that he was looking at hell right in the face. He went towards it for me. This is the only way that God could save us. God himself had to take the wrath so we could be saved from it, so we could be free from it. After this happens in the garden, we see how not to respond to grace, how not to respond to this love. We see how Peter responded, which is the wrong way. So Matthew chapter 26, verse 47 says, while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd, with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, the one I will kiss is the man, seize him. And he came up to Jesus at once and said, greetings, Rabbi, and he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, friend, do what you came to do. Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples left him and fled. Right after Jesus has this horrific moment, this hell moment in the garden, one of his best friends comes to him, Judas, and betrays him, who brings with him a crowd of people that are going to take him towards his impending death right after that experience in the garden. And then Peter comes along. We know it's Peter who takes out his sword because of the other accounts of this story. But I can relate a lot to Peter myself. Peter is the kind of guy who's loyal, the guy who wants to protect his friends, the guy who's trying to do what he feels is the right thing to do. And I do that a lot of the time. And he says, I fell asleep in the garden, but I will protect you, Jesus. I will protect you. I may have fell asleep before, but I have my sword. Let's fight. That's what Peter is saying. But after Peter does this, Jesus responds, and again in a way that we would not expect him to respond. Verse 52 says, then Jesus said to him, put your sword back in its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then should the scriptures be fulfilled that it must be so? And at the time, a legion consisted of about 5,000 soldiers. So Jesus here is saying that if I really wanted to, I could call down 60,000 angels from heaven to come and fight with me. If I really needed, I could call 60,000 angels to fight for me. For reference, Revelation 7 says there's 4 angels that will come who have the power to take out all the armies on earth. 4. Jesus is saying, I have 60,000 right here if I need them. Jesus is saying to Peter, Peter, I have an army if I need it. I'm not dying because I've been caught up in a terrible situation. I'm not getting arrested because this is not what's supposed to happen. I don't need your sword, Peter. I need your life. I don't need your sword. I'm going to my death because this is the way that it needs to be. And then he goes on to talk about prophecies that are going to be fulfilled. And this is one way, this is the only way it can work. And there were over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that Jesus fulfilled on his time on earth. Things spoken thousands of years, hundreds of years before Jesus came to earth, predicting what Jesus would do on earth, and he accomplished every single one. But Peter and the rest of the disciples are still missing the entirety of what is happening. They're missing entirely what is going on. They're missing the big picture of what Jesus is doing in this moment. Last week, Pastor Dave showed us how some of us are Judas. But this morning, that when it comes to our faith, we have a price tag when it comes to our faith, some of us. But this morning, I want to say how some of us might be Peter. Peter had a misguided understanding of some of the things that were going on in this situation. Like many of us do today. Like many people, we view the world like most movies. We have good guys and we have bad guys. We have the Jedi and we have the Sith. We have the liberals and conservatives. We have dog lovers and cat lovers. we view the world as good and bad. That's how we view the world. We think if we're a dog lover, that cat lovers are like the worst kind of people. I have a dog at home. I never thought I'd get a dog, and now I have one. Cat, I'll probably never get. But we view the world as good guys and bad guys. That's how we view the world. We view the world like Peter. But Jesus in this moment, he's saying, Peter, there are no good guys. There are none. There's only people who rebel against God. That's it. There's no good guys. You are not a good guy, Peter. That's what he's saying to him. When we look at life as it is, as if we look at life as if we're right all the time, what that tends to lead to is judgment towards people. Because we view life as if we're always right. And when we think we're right, that's when we start to judge people for that. They view things differently than us. Their worldview is different. And we start to judge people based on what we think is right. That's what Peter was doing in this moment. He's saying, I'm a good guy. I'm going to protect you, Jesus. I will fight to my death for you. And Jesus says, put away your sword. Stop fighting. Stop judging. You know, if we're Christian and someone is not, oftentimes you bear a sword of judgment towards them. The only thing different about them and you is that you've accepted the gift of grace. That's it. You're not a good person. Jesus is saying there's no good people. The only thing that matters is if you accept me. Much like Peter with his sword, he was saying, Jesus, I will fight for you. You don't need to go through this. I will fight to the death for you. I got you. I'm one of the good guys. What Peter didn't realize is Jesus needed to go to the cross for him instead of him. No amount of good works, no amount of protection can save us. Only the cross can save us. Isaiah talks about this. Isaiah 64, verse 6. It says, we have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. We all fade like a leaf. All our iniquities, like the wind, take us away. We are all unclean. We are all unworthy. Our good works are like polluted garments, are like dirty rags before him. They're worth nothing. You know, Judas, he tried to send Jesus to the cross to get rid of him, while Peter tried to protect Jesus by preventing him from going to the cross. Both approached this story in the wrong way. Both men did not understand the beauty of this moment, the importance of this moment. Jesus going to the cross was the only way that you could be saved, that I could be saved, that they could be saved. The only way. True salvation is not something that we can achieve through good works, through good deeds. It's something we must receive through the power of the cross. That's it. You will never be a good enough person. I will never be a good enough person. But Jesus came to take the cup we deserve so we could be free. There's only one thing Jesus accomplished by going to the cross. Only one thing that he received by going to the cross. He didn't get riches. He didn't get fame. He didn't get wealth. He didn't get the approval of the Father because he already had the approval of the Father. The only thing he got by going to the cross was you. That's it. That's why he went for you instead of you and for me. That's the only thing he got by going to the cross was you and me. He sweat blood in the garden for you. It is by grace alone that we can be saved. It's by grace alone. Let's not be like Peter, who responded to the world of trouble with violence. Let's respond to the gospel. Let's respond to violence with love. Let's respond to people with love. Let's turn the other cheek. Let's be symbols of grace and love and not war. Let's not bear the sword of judgment. The only way we can respond to this moment in the garden is by standing in awe. Standing in amazement that this man came and died for me. He came and died for you. He sweat blood in the garden for you. Stand knowing that we are saved by grace.